Now that I'm about halfway through the first phase of the Black curriculum, I've noticed that there are still some layers of the Black experience that aren't heavily spoken about. One of them being mass incarceration. So this week's video is revolving around the book called The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness by Michelle Alexander. So in this video, I'm going to throw around some terms that you may not completely be familiar with in hopes of creating a wider scope as to why mass incarceration is plaguing the African American community. I'll start with the Jim Crow era, include Brown versus Board of Education, transition into the Civil Rights Movement, highlight the war on drugs by the Reagan administration, define the metaphor of the new Jim Crow or racial caste system, and bring it all together to talk about why we still live in a colorblind society. And I cannot ignore the fact that this book was written by an African American woman, writer, activist, and mother. I feel like in a lot of ways a woman would have to write such a gripping and compelling topic related to the disposition of African American men in the United States. And so here we go. The Jim Crow law. Now, I must admit now, when you're reading this book, it starts off with slavery, but I won't really go there. I'll start off with the Jim Crow era. Now, this era was during the Reconstruction era of the U.S. when slaves were deemed free, but they didn't have the proper tools to basically educate themselves, financially equip themselves, and to give them the same benefit and leg up in society. Eventually, the whites, former slave masters, etc., they eventually saw a threat in that the Negroes would have more of a privilege than they would in the current society. And so what they decided to do was basically play on the fears of the middle class whites and saying that you could live a better life if we were more segregated. So laws were passed to basically make that segregation a lot more transparent. I really like what Michelle Alexander says about the effects of the Jim Crow era and how it affected the Black community. She said that racial segregation rendered the Black experience pretty much invisible to whites, thus maintaining the Black stereotype with regards to our race, culture, and values. And it also made it easier to deny our suffering at that time. Now, fortunately, this era didn't last too long. A famous court case, Brown versus Board of Education, basically ruled all the laws that are separating whites from blacks in the school system unconstitutional. So now you're going to bring all the Negroes and white kids together and they're going to learn something. Fast forward from Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 to about a decade ahead to the Civil Rights Movement, where you have a lot more heightened awareness and overt speaking about the marginalization of African Americans in the United States and what can be done about civil rights for us and by us. So you do start to see some progress with regards to race issues in the United States, yeah? I mean, the civil rights, a lot of documentation on that. But around 1982, President Reagan issues his campaign called the War on Drugs. Now, why in the world would you do something like that? So what did the war on drugs do exactly? Well, it got a lot of black people put into prisons, and it got a lot of money fueled into police funding. So this War on Drugs campaign ultimately birthed what Michelle Alexander calls the new Jim Crow law. Segregation wouldn't suffice in the present day. Now you needed to package it different. And so now police force, those in higher power would go for the same marginalized, disenfranchised groups, such as poor blacks. She goes on further to call this new Jim Crow a racial caste system, meaning that once you're in prison, you get stamped as a felon, convict. That label and stamp is going to follow you when you try to find a job, when you try to buy property, when you try to do a lot more things. And that really doesn't go away when it comes to trying to rebuild your life after you've been incarcerated. On the outside looking in, you might think two things. One, justice is served and those criminals are put away. Or two, you realize that there's a certain population in the US that's being targeted and put into the criminal system. And you realize that there's a huge disparity between law and order and justice. Now, I won't get into the numbers of a huge difference between the number of blacks and Latinos being in the prison system and the number of whites who commit the same crimes that are not in the prison system. But I will say that we do still live in a colorblind society today. Have you ever heard somebody say this? Well, President Obama made it to the office, so we're over race now. I mean, the U.S., we're past that. No, we're not. One African American male becoming the President of the United States does not mean that the U.S. has become a post-racial society, especially when there's a huge portion of society that completely neglects and refuses to see that there's a huge disparity between those who are wrongfully incarcerated. There's still a huge and voiceless community that are the product of racial profiling and perpetual marginalization. Let's face it, if you want to dig deeper, the numbers are there. I mean, looking at this book alone, her reference section takes up half the book, so there you go. And as a young African American male, this issue of mass incarceration does hit home for me and my family. I know that some of you may be watching this, don't buy it. And I think this is the exact point that I want to address. I think you don't buy it because you don't see it. I mean, when Michelle Alexander brought up the illustration of the Jim Crow laws and the way that looked in reality, whites did not see the black experience at all. They didn't work with them, they didn't eat with them, they didn't talk to them. This perpetuated the stereotypes of blacks. And so what you have now is this perpetual marginalization where we are the ones who are being targeted for petty crimes. And I know you might be thinking to yourself, well, what about black on black crime? That is a continuous conversation that black people are having in the black community. Like I said, if you really, really understood and heard our voice, then you wouldn't be asking that question. On the other end, you have those black mothers, sisters, wives who have loved ones who are incarcerated. And so another question being asked specifically in the black community is, where have all the brothers gone? Michelle Alexander brings up a time where President Obama gathered a lot of people inside of a congregation in a church, and it was Father's Day. And so he begged the overall African American congregation to be better fathers. So he got applauses and praise from everyone listening to his message, and he kept insisting that there's a void, that black fathers are missing in their children's lives and families and what have you. What he didn't say was where you can find a lot of those black fathers. And so you see the connection there, right? You see that President Obama making this claim that a lot of us are missing. Well, I can tell you where some of us are. Some of us are deep within the layer of the colorblind society, meaning that everyone assumes now, because of President Obama's rise to being president, that we live in a post-racial society. It's really not the case, though. We still have a lot of groundwork to do with regards to race relations, race talk, and ultimately criminal justice that Michelle Alexander is so skilled in articulating in this book. And so again, after reading a book like this, I'm very compelled to do my own research, go further with regards to this issue, what's being done, the court cases, talking to friends, family, and raising more awareness of the voiceless with regards to mass incarceration that has affected the African American community for quite some time now. I don't really have a nice way of ending this video, but I will say that part of being black is to be raised with a heightened awareness to look out for things that other people tend to take for granted on a regular basis. So I guess it's a challenge to American citizens, white and black, to be cautious, to be aware, and to challenge ourselves to really uphold a criminal justice system that displays true justice. This is the Black Curriculum.